Today's lesson is on John 2, the whole chapter. We're going to be covering all of it today. Hopefully we can get through it in time. I'm used to teaching an hour on Wednesday, so we're going to try to cut this down to 45 minutes. So I want to start out with a question today, and I want you to think about it. What makes you believe someone is truly who they say they are? Remember, this theme that John has is about belief in his book. Is it what they do or what they stand for? Well, I mean, today we're going to see both from Jesus. And we're going to see the beginning of belief in his disciples and in the greater Jewish community with what we cover today. So last week, Scott talked to us about signs and controversies and the institutions they were associated with. And this first part of John contains both. He has his first sign, which is the wedding in Cana, where he turns water into wine. And the second part of John 2 is his first controversy. It's when he goes to the temple at Jerusalem and he kicks up a fuss about the money changing in the temple. So we're going to cover both of those items in today's lesson. And I know some of this is you guys' favorite, especially Phil with the wine. So we're gonna try to cover that thoroughly so that you understand what that was about and not just having a good time with wine, Phil. But seriously, I love both of these stories, and I never really gave too much in-depth thought about his first miracle. I thought it was kind of cool and different, and why did he start his ministry that way? So we're going to try to explore that a little bit more and see what was behind that for him. So, and the second half, of course, with him cleansing the temple, so to speak, driving out the money changers in the Gentile court. This wasn't in the inner part of the temple. This was on the outer parts of the temple, but still, it was a holy place, right? So he called them out on that, and so he really showed in these two stories his power and his purity, and that's the theme here in this lesson. All right, so I'm going to start with revisiting something we've covered a couple of times in John because I want it to stick in your memory, and I'm sure Jay and Scott have mentioned this too, and probably will again in the next time we cover John also, but it's important because this is his theme, right? It's John 20, 30, 31. Now, Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. So that is his whole purpose here, is belief. And he starts it out with belief in John 2. So John 1, we covered that a couple of weeks ago, and he talked about a different kind of beginning where the other three gospels talk about Jesus' birth and everything that led up to that and those events. He starts it out in a very different way. And then the second part of John 1, he calls his disciples. So he calls the first of his named disciples, and those are Andrew, and the background here, if you remember, they were John's disciples, right? There were a couple of disciples with John, and John said, "Hey, there's the Lamb of God," and the disciples were like, "Cool, we're going to go with him." So, okay, that's not actually what they said, but but it was close, yeah. So that was Andrew, who was Simon Peter's brother. So Peter and Andrew were his first named disciples that we have record of in John. And then Philip and Nathaniel, who he also picked up in Bethsaida. So right after he gets these four disciples, it goes straight into the wedding at Cana. So, and there's a lot of symbolism in these stories. First of all, It's his first sign that's recorded in John. And all throughout the Bible, you hear this theme of the bridegroom, like we're his bride and he's the bridegroom. And it's so poignant that he starts out his ministry, his first miracle at a wedding. So I know I made a joke. I don't think the wine was the point, even though it kind of was, and I'll explain it to you. But it was, that's how he's always referred to with us. He's our bridegroom, we're his bride, and he starts out his ministry showing us his power at a wedding of all places. It is more significant than I think we realize, because when we're called back, he says we're his bride then too, right? So all throughout his ministry, from the beginning to the very, very end, this is a theme for him, and I think it's important that he starts out this way. So, and also, it just shows us in this story, one thing that I love about it is it shows his compassion. So it seems like a trivial thing. Like, why would he do this? Why would this be his first miracle? Why wouldn't it be something grandiose, or something seemingly more impossible, like raising somebody from the dead, which he did multiple times? Why is it this? But I think it's important for us to realize that he cares about us so much that even the seemingly trivial things are important to him. They're important to him because they're important to us. And that's how it should be with a spouse relationship, right? Things that might not matter to me, if it matters to my husband, suddenly it's important to me, right? So I think it's a very important point to say that it does seem kind of like a trivial miracle, but it wasn't trivial. It wasn't trivial to those people, so it wasn't trivial to Jesus. There's been historically, and I just wanted to throw this in there, the traditional site of the wedding at Cana has been a different location called Cana. I should have looked up the pronunciations, I apologize, which is about 4.5 miles northeast of Nazareth. But modern scholars believe the site to be inaccurate due to recent excavation work. So they actually think it's now called a place called Cana, which is about 8 to 9 miles north of Nazareth. And there are several clues that kind of gave them that, including excavation work that's been pretty recent. So I have a picture there of the excavation site in Cana, where they believe it is. And you can see over here, I'm not used to using the pointer, this is the site right here, and this is Nazareth, where Jesus was located. So we're going to see that he starts out at Nazareth, goes to Cana, and then at the end, he's down at the end of this first story, he goes down to Capernaum, which is why I have it located there. So you can kind of see the path that he went right there, if that's accurate. The other site is probably around here a little bit. So for the sake of our story, whichever one is correct, it probably doesn't matter a lot, but I thought I'd throw that in there for all of you who are interested. Okay, one of the reasons why people think this is likely too, because in John 4:46, there's another story where he says, so he came again to Cana in Galilee, where he had made the water to wine. And at Capernaum, there was an official whose son was ill, and you've heard this recently if you attended Wednesday nights. And when this man heard that Jesus had come to Judea to Galilee, he went to him and asked him to come down. So part of the Khirbet Cana site is that it's clearly, I'm not used to using that little thing. Clearly mountainous, where you'd have to come down. It's got a ridge. You have to come down from there. And the initial historical site is not like that. So, but it does make you think that maybe part of the reason why Jesus was just like, go, your son will live, is because he probably didn't want to make that hike 50 miles over to Capernaum, doing all that work for that. So he's like, I can heal him from here. No big deal, sir. Oops. I apologize. The clicker in me today. So Nazareth kind of sits higher, so he'd go down to Cana, And then lower, at sea level is where Capernaum is. It's in Galilee. So it's kind of like a depression. It's actually below sea level. It's about 700 feet below sea level. All right, so this is where our story begins, John 2, 1 through 3. And it's important to introduce this correctly. So in Jewish wedding tradition, after betrothal, after it was all set up, there was often a long preparation period while the groom readied a place. He'd often add a room to his father's house. And you've heard that language said by Jesus before too. So I go to prepare a place for you in my father's house where there are many rooms. So this is an idea from a tradition that the Jews had with weddings and marriage. This could take months or even up to a year. The groom would then come with a procession at an unexpected time, often at night, and the bride needed to be ready. Think about the parable of the 10 virgins, right, in Matthew 25. So this was also a Jewish tradition. It was an unusual thing, even though we think, why would he be doing this? But that is how they traditionally held weddings and preparations. So the wedding was a major community event. The groom was financially responsible for a wedding, and it could last up to a week. So he was financially responsible for the whole thing after he set everything up. So betrothal was not to be taken lightly. You better be ready to be married. And so running out of wine would not just be a social embarrassment, but seen as a shame to his whole family as well. And you've got the whole community there. Like I said, it was a community event. So this would be an embarrassing thing for the groom. And that's how we start our story in John 2:1. So on the third day, there was a wedding at Cana in Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus also was invited to the wedding with his disciples. When the wine ran out, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." So like I said, the disciples, it was probably at least 4 at this point. We have 4 named ones. And the mother of Jesus was with him. And Jesus said to her, "Woman, what does this have to do with me? My hour has not yet come." I know some people probably think this is a harsh way to talk to your mother. Like he doesn't even call her mom or anything like this, but this was not the first instance he had of this, or not the last instance, I should say. He spoke to her when he gave her as a mother to John when he was dying on the cross. He also referred to her as woman then. So it wasn't a mean or rude thing that he was doing. It was just...
It's never intended that way.
Right, Mother's Day, and I'm talking about this. That's funny. But yeah, he didn't... I don't think I think he was just speaking directly to her, and it wasn't meant to be affectionate at the moment. He was just speaking to her as a woman. So it was just not as personal as his normal conversation would be with her, but it wasn't necessarily rude like maybe we would think of it now. If my daughter said woman instead of mom, I would be like, what is you mad at me about? I'd be like, why are you doing this to me? But I don't think it was like that back then, and so I don't think we should read too much into that. But it wasn't personal, and part of the reason why it wasn't personal is that he was reminding her about his mission. It was for the Father, not for personal favors, right? And my hour, when he says my hour, he's referring to his appointed time in God's plan. So his mission was from God. He's referring to the hour of his appointed time, but everything about this speaks to that compassion, right? Because even though he's aware of his mission, he's aware of his appointed time from God, he's also aware of the situation, and he does have compassion, right? So there's lots of times in John where he refers to his hour. In John 7, his hours had not yet come. John 12, the hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. John 13:1, Jesus knows his hour has come to depart. John 17:1, Father, the hour has come, glorify your Son. So he's clearly talking about the end of his mission when he refers to the hour here. But instead of listening to what he said, his mother just says to the servants, do whatever he tells you. So Mary fully believed her son would do something to help, that he was that compassionate Savior. She had faith in him. Mary's instruction reveals really true faith in her son, a trust so certain that it can only produce obedience. So she fully had faith and trust in her son to the point of obedience in him, but she really had faith that he would do this and that he was a compassionate Savior. Now there were 6 stone water jars there for Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. Jesus said to the servants, fill the jars with water, and they filled them up to the brim. And he said to them, now draw some out and take it to the master of the feast. So they took it. So purification jars, I meant to put a picture in here, and I don't know what happened, but anyway, they were stone jars. They didn't make them out of clay. They were stone on purpose because it was believed that was part of what made them clean, right? Keep out the impurities. So they held about 120 to 180 gallons each when filled, and they were probably used for cleaning their hands in this situation, but it could have been any ritual purification. It was probably used for hand cleansing at the wedding. So this is what he used. They emptied the jars of the water, and they didn't empty it. He changed the. I'm sorry. He changed the use of the jars from water purification to wine. When the master of the feast tasted the water now became wine and did not know where it came from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew, the master of the feast called the bridegroom and said to him, everyone serves the good wine first, and when people have drunk freely, then the poor wine. But you have kept the good wine until now. So it's kind of ironic. The servants knew, the master of the feast did not know. So the master of the feast essentially confirms the miracle to everybody, those who did not know and those who did know. He confirmed how miraculous it was, not just turning it into wine, but turning it into the good wine, the best wine. So really up until that point, the servants knew, Mary knew, maybe the disciples knew, but other people didn't know. This was just handed off to the master of the feast. And the master of the feast was a guy who would taste all the food and wine. He, helped coordinate, oversee the wedding banquet for the full length of it, whether it was a few days or a week. And he was very interested in protecting the family's reputation. So the running out of wine affected him and his job greatly. And this saying, the best wine comes last, it sounds like covenant fulfillment. So think about Isaiah 25:6. On this mountain, the Lord of hosts will make for all peoples a feast of rich food, a feast of well-aged wine, of rich food full of marrow, and of aged wine well refined. And Amos 9:13. Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when the plowman shall overtake the reaper, and the treader of grapes him who sows the seed. The mountains shall drip with sweet wine, and all the hills shall flow with it. So it's not just a miracle to help these people save face, even though it is a compassionate deed for him to do that. But it is fulfillment or the beginning of the fulfillment of these prophecies from the Old Testament that we're starting to see here. And this scene of the wedding ends like this. John 2:11. This, the first of his signs, Jesus did at Cana in Galilee and manifested his glory. And his disciples believed in him. So I think it's kind of ironic that this is what causes the disciples to believe in him, but clearly they knew what had happened if this is what caused them to believe in him. It's important to note that John talks about signs and connects them to belief all throughout his book. And he's saying it here again directly to us. This is his first sign, and it manifested his glory, and it caused belief. And that is his whole theme. The whole purpose of his book is to talk about that belief, to cause belief. And he's showing how this first event caused belief in his own disciples. So it's a very poignant reference back to that. And and it doesn't say that there are any other witnesses that believed. He's just referring to the disciples. Mary already believed. They don't talk about the servants, whether they believed or not. They're just saying it caused the disciples to believe. All right. Got plenty of time. We're going to go into our next half of the book, of the chapter, introducing the temple cleansing. This is, well, let me show you the temple timeline. That's not a great picture on the screen. It looked better on my computer, but the story relates to the outer courts. So, yeah, that looks way better on my screen. Sorry, guys. But the outer courts would be outside of the temple here. It's not anything inside of the temple here. So we're talking about money changers and people being in these outer courts out here.
A bit more, maybe. No, you've got it pretty dim.
All right, let's see. And I just want to remind you guys, so the first temple was Solomon's temple, and it was destroyed in 586 BC. Second temple Zerubbabel, rebuilt in 516 BC. So they had that 70-year window there that we talked about when we covered the Old Testament. And this is not a third temple. This is a renovation of that second temple. So Herod renovated it, and oftentimes as a result, it's referred to as Herod's temple, and his renovation started in 20 BC. He more than doubled the size of it on the Temple Mount. He built enormous retaining walls, and you can see that still today. I don't have a picture of it. I know Leo's shown us several times pictures of the Western Wall. So he built those giant walls when he did this renovation in 20 BC. And he improved the temple structure itself. And he really turned it into one of the most impressive buildings in the greater Roman world at the time as a result of all these renovations that he did. So he really put a lot of money and work into the restoration of this temple at the time. And then, of course, it was destroyed 50 years later by Rome. I will say one note before starting this one, that it's kind of funny. It's a funny note to me that in these two stories, he's changing the use of these these traditions, and that the Jews held on to. So the ritual purification jars were not used for that anymore. He filled them up with wine for a wedding, right? And then you're going to see, he's changing the use of the temple back to what the Father intended for it to be used for, which is a place of worship. So he was driving out and purifying the temple. So I just think that's a significant point that we shouldn't overlook. All right. So as I said before, he went from Nazareth to Cana. Capernaum is where he's going now, and he went down because that's below sea level. So it's 700 feet below sea level, and this is where we're starting the story, with his mother and his brothers and his disciples, and they stayed there for a few days. The Passover of the Jews was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple, he found those who were selling oxen and sheep and pigeons, a lot of translations say doves, and the money changers sitting there. So essentially what they're saying here is the outer courts, these Gentile courts, had become a marketplace. It crowded out prayer, and it exploited worshipers. Worshipers were required to bring sacrifices 3 times a year. They needed to go and bring sacrifices. And buying animals in Jerusalem was, I'm sure, more convenient, right? If you're traveling with an animal, things can happen. It can get hurt. You're much better off probably getting something when you arrive versus trying to haul an animal 70 or 80 or more miles wherever you're coming from for a sacrifice, especially 3 times a year. It's a lot of work. The animals can get sick, they can get injured. You have to make sure they stay okay, and it's stressful. So it would just add an extra stressor to the trip that people didn't need. But it still didn't have a place inside the temple. So I thought this map was interesting because it kind of shows Jesus' journey. If you, trying to get my bearings. If you look over here, he started in Nazareth, went up to around here for the wedding in Cana, went to Capernaum, and then there's 3 traditional routes that he could take for the route to go to Jerusalem. So the one in the middle is the Samaritan woman route that he took. We all know that story. The most likely route he took was either that or the Jordan Valley route over here to get there. And, we hear instances of him of being in Bethany a lot also. So, but, when he resurrected, we hear about him being on the road to Emmaus also. So we're not sure. He was probably familiar with all the routes, and he probably took them often, since he had to do it at least 3 times a year, right? So from Nazareth down to Kirbet Cana, that was 9 miles and down, 1,150 feet. And then down further to Capernaum, remember, below sea level, that would have been about 20 to 25 miles and down another 1,400 feet. And then from there, he goes up to Jerusalem. Now, up, I will say, like even Jericho here is still below sea level. So for most of the journey, he's not going up. He's going along the river if he goes this way. So up is just when he's going up to the Temple Mount. But it was still a long trek and 2,500 feet up from his other elevation. So it was a hike to get up there every year for all of the travelers. It was not an easy journey. And trying to bring an animal through that would not have been an easy journey. And making a whip of cords, he drove them all out of the temple with the sheep and oxen. And he poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. And he told those who sold the pigeons, "Take these things away. Do not make my Father's house a house of trade." So again, he doesn't mention that they're doing anything corrupt or illegitimate. He's just saying, your business doesn't belong here. So I know a lot of people like to preach on it being a corrupt practice, or them, changing money at inflated rates, or saying their animals weren't good enough to use so that they were forced to buy theirs. And the story doesn't really identify any of that stuff going on. It simply says, my Father's house shouldn't be a house of trade. So I don't think it's good to just go out there and say it. There might be historical evidence that that's true, that they were saying it, but this story does not say it. And the other time Jesus cleanses the temple, which is later on in his ministry, it does not say it there either. So in Mark 11:15 to 17, he does this again. And they came to Jerusalem, and Jesus, entered the temple and began to drive out those who sold and those who bought in the temple. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold pigeons. And he would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. And he was teaching them and saying to them, "Is it not written, 'My house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations,' but you have made it a den of robbers." So that is a little bit more aggressive, and but it still never outright says what they were doing. So I'll just leave it at that. We can make assumptions of what they were doing, and they probably were, or at least some of them. But he doesn't identify anything further beyond that. His disciples remembered that it was written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." And that's a reference to Psalm 69:9, which says, "Because zeal for your house has consumed me, and the insults of those who insult you have fallen on me." And this is a Davidic psalm, and it's one of suffering and of righteous zeal. And it speaks about being consumed with passion for God's honor and dwelling. And the New Testament identifies this as a messianic psalm through this. And I know we've talked about the Messianic Psalms before, so it's just interesting that it's directly associating it with it in the disciples' minds. And John does this so often. He, instead of just telling the story like Matthew, Mark, and Luke often do, he likes to put context in there. So he's very big on saying, like, putting it together for readers. He doesn't want people to be confused about it. He wants people to believe, so he makes sure he's very direct about it. And he says his disciples remembered this and points back to why it's important, why it's messianic. So he's really pointing back to Christ's glory, his righteousness, and his justification in doing that, right? But it was not a mild righteous indignation, right? He's making a whip of cords, which it's for driving animals. It's not the kind of whip they whipped him with. Don't be mistaken. He's not really hurting people like he was hurt, but it's still consuming him with this righteousness, even until the end of his life, because he did this at the beginning of his ministry and he did this at the end of his ministry. He was so consumed with this righteous zeal for God throughout his entire ministry on earth. And he died with that zeal even until his last breath and his last words. So the Jews said to him, "What sign do you show us for doing these things?" Jesus answered them, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." The Jews he's referring to here are Jewish leaders. He's not talking about the general population of the Jews. I know we've talked about that before. And they demanded a miracle as proof, and that would have been easy for Jesus. But he didn't want to do that. He didn't want to be some kind of, I don't know, for lack of a better word, like show pony, right? He wasn't going to do that for them. He wanted belief in him to be about real faith. Faith comes from is heard, and what is heard comes through the message of Christ, according to Paul in Romans 10:17, right? It's not about miracles. That's superficial faith. If you believe just because of a miracle and that's what your whole faith is based on, you're not obeying God. You're not believing in the word and what you hear, right? From the word. So the faith comes from what is heard, and what is heard comes through the message of Christ. And he wasn't about to change that for them just so they would believe, because he knew they weren't really going to believe. They were just going to think, oh, he's, they said it about him. When they did see the miracles or when they heard about him, right? They still didn't believe. That wasn't what that was all about. And he wasn't going to do that for them here either. The Jews then said, "It has taken 46 years to build this temple, and you will raise it up in 3 days?" But he was speaking about the temple of his body. When therefore he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this, and they believed the scripture and the word that Jesus had spoken. So again, they're talking specifically about the disciples' belief here. And you have to remember, in John 1, he had just called his disciples. So it is important to establish a basis of belief and faith with the disciples. But it's so interesting that John gives us this context that otherwise we kind of have to read into in some of the other scriptures and put together ourselves and connect the dots. But John connects all the dots for us because he doesn't want us to misunderstand. He wants us to believe. That's his purpose. So he very clearly states he was speaking about the temple of his body. He doesn't want us to give it any other meaning than what he knows Jesus was saying. And therefore he was raised from the dead. Therefore he was raised from the dead. And his disciples remembered and they believed. Again, he's talking about his disciples' belief. And you have to think during that whole time up until the end, when John's referencing here, the disciples did sometimes waver, right? They didn't understand certain things. They when they took him away, right? Peter betrayed him 3 times, This was it was a loyal group, but they weren't solidified. They weren't cemented in their faith the way they were once that occurred and he came back and they remembered all his teachings and it all came to light in their brains and it all connected together what Jesus really meant. Because oftentimes they didn't understand what he meant. And sometimes they would explicitly say, tell us what these things mean, because they didn't understand him. So this is a point where John is making sure we understand, hey, his disciples didn't realize it all throughout this whole time they're with him. But afterwards, they look back to this moment, this time where he's talking to the Jewish leadership and they're connecting the dots and they're saying, got it now. His resurrected body. We understand this now. And it solidified their belief even further. Now, when he was in Jerusalem at the Passover feast, many believed in his name when they saw the signs that he was doing. So here they're expanding the belief group. But listen to the next verse. But Jesus, on his part, did not entrust himself to them, because he knew all people and needed no one to bear witness about man, for he himself knew what was in man. So this goes back to that superficial faith. These people that believed, many believed in his name when they saw the signs. They didn't believe from the hearing of the word, from what Jesus said. They didn't believe in his teaching. They believed because they saw the signs. And Jesus, he did not entrust himself to them because of that. It was not true belief. They didn't listen to his sermons. They didn't listen to his teaching and his preaching and believe. They just believed because of the signs, and he didn't want that. So when the Jewish leaders asked for a sign and he gave that response to them, this is why. Because he doesn't entrust himself to people who believe just because of signs. He needs more. He needs a deeper relationship, and that's why he did not entrust himself to those folks. And again, that kind of goes back to the first story, right? Like marriage, you can't just have a superficial love, right? You have to have something deeper there. You can't live with somebody every day just because they're cute and think that's going to work out, right? Something more has to be there. So I think it does kind of go back to all of that and the whole idea that Jesus wants something deeper, a deeper bond with us, a deeper relationship. He wants us to believe. So we're going to end with this. I use Scott's theme. The Bible, it hits you, it gets you, it fits you. He didn't put that in there, by the way. I actually did it of my own free will. So Jesus reveals his glory through both compassion and confrontation. He reveals his passion, his zeal for the house of the Lord through cleansing the temple. And he reveals his compassion for people, because not only did he have compassion on those Gentile worshipers, he wanted them to experience true worship with God and not have all of that in the Gentile courts corrupting their experience, right? But he also showed compassion at the wedding for the bridegroom that would have been embarrassed about not having any wine left for his guests when the whole community, it's a community event, is there to experience this. And it's amazing, once again, that this is a wedding, that this, throughout his ministry, he talks about him being the bridegroom, and he, as his first miracle, saved the reputation, had compassion on that bridegroom for his situation. Jesus is not only powerful enough to transform lives, but pure enough to demand holiness. So when he did that at the courts, he was doing that at the Gentile courts, right? But he demanded holiness for everybody. He demanded the Jews to be respectful of the Gentile worship. He wanted the Gentile worship to be pure and to be holy and to be right. So, and John 2 calls us to trust his power, honor his purity, and believe in him. Thank you very much, everybody.